Alright, so welcome everybody. So we are in the 5th of our 6-week series, and the goals of the class, just to remind yourselves, was to provide an overview of our United Methodist denomination and encourage reflection on how the United Methodist Church influences our faith, or how we understand God and how our relationship is with God. And by the end of the class, be able to answer this question: why am I a Methodist? So hopefully we're almost there. Okay, so this is our schedule. That we started off with an introduction, talked about our connectionalism with other churches in the denomination. We had a week on UMC doctrine. Last week was understanding God, and we talked about the quadrilateral and theological issues. And so today we're going to talk about social principles and social issues and how we apply this to daily life. And then next week will be our last week, which will be on church and membership. So before I continue on, did anybody have any questions from last week? I didn't get any emails at 10 o'clock at night last night to answer questions. No? Okay. All right. So let's start off with a video. This one's a little longer because it's not part of our promotional videos.
Do you want the lights off?
Sure.
So.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that stands by the water. We shall not be moved. We'll build a mighty union. We shall not be moved. We'll build a mighty union. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that stands by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that stands by the water. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our children. We're fighting for our children. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our children. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that stands by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that stands by the water. We shall not be moved.
Stronghold, anchor.
Okay.
That sounds like last week.
Okay. So the title is wrong on this, but the goals are correct.
Sure.
Actually, it's all about understanding God.
That's right.
So this week is on social issues. And so our goal today is to learn how Methodists determine how to address issues and how they are addressed. Learn what the official UMC position is on various topics, and reflect on the 3 simple rules of our faith on social issues. And we'll talk about more about what the simple rules are later on. Okay. Can you see me okay? So last time I put up this little line that said doctrine, theology, and principles. Anybody remember that? So 2 weeks ago we talked about doctrine, which kind of provides a context on how we're going to approach religion and our faith. Last week we talked about theology, which then takes that context and then we look into how do we understand God. And so then that then leads into how do we actually apply that. And one of the key components of our Methodist faith is putting our faith into practice, practical divinity, practical faith. So that's what we're going to do this week. And the social principles, I'm going to go into a little bit more of that, is a set of principles written, developed by the United Methodist Church, and it basically says that the social principles of the United Methodist Church are a call to be a prayerful, studied dialogue of faith and practice. Think about that. Dialogue of faith and practice. So we'll come back to this in a little bit.
Yep. On that, just to refresh my memory, we talked about quadrilateral last week.
Yes.
So is that doctrine or is that theology?
That was how we, it's a tool that we use to help us in our theology of understanding God, studying God.
So the doctrine was
what do we believe as far as the church and God? Remember we had the articles of faith, confession, articles of religion, confession of faith. Okay. All right. So the United Methodist Church has a pretty long history of being involved with social issues, both on the positive side, but also we need to remember that there was a darker side too. So, for example, on the brighter side, for lack of a better phrase, slavery was an issue that was dealt with very early in the Methodist Church. And in fact, caused the Methodist Church to eventually split into the North and South just before the Civil War. The Methodist Church was involved with immigration, and several of us went to Gumboon last week, or a week and a half ago, where they reopened the building in San Francisco. And this originally started as a mission to the Chinese immigrant women who were coming over, and a lot of them were being brought over for slavery or prostitution. So Gumboon was helping to save these women. There's temperance and prohibition. How many people have had U.S. history in high school? So 1920s was the era of prohibition. Okay, but women's suffrage and the equality of women to be able to vote. Child labor laws, which we saw in 1908. And there's a couple outgrowths of Methodism, and they're not tied to the Methodists, but the founders were connected with Methodists. So I put these up just for some context. So Salvation Army and Goodwill Industries. In fact, I think there was some discussion about having more cooperation at the global level of Salvation Army and Methodists a couple of years back. On the darker side, like I mentioned, there was a split over slavery that some people interpreted slavery in one direction and others in the other direction. There were some individuals, and the church can't be responsible for all its individuals. We all act according to our faith, but for example, there was a pastor who was in charge of militia in Colorado, and they massacred quite a few Indians back then. And then there was another pastor in Georgia who was involved with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s. So, yeah, so there's things for us to remember in our history that although we strive for the betterment of the world and to share God's love, that sometimes there are those dark sides that we need to be careful of. So there's been a long history of United Methodist involvement in social issues, but actually the way that social issues were looked at over the years has changed quite a bit. And early on in the Methodist Church, actually it could be said that the Methodists were late to what we call the social gospel, or connecting the gospel to social issues. Before, in the United States, there was a lot of emphasis on private piety as opposed to institutional effort, and we'll get into the institutional efforts of the Methodist Church in a little bit. But there was a lot of emphasis on our personal faith. And so actually it was, we're lagged a little bit behind the Baptists who were kind of I don't want to say the founders, but they really pushed the social gospel and this interaction of the whole church involved with social issues. There was a pastor by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch who started what was called Hell's Kitchen, not the same as our TV show now, but the kitchen was there to kind of like our city team ministries or St. Vincent de Paul. And then after him came a Methodist by the name of William Carwardine, who was in Chicago at the time of the Pullman strike. This was in the late 1800s, 1894. And he inadvertently became part of that movement of trying to advocate on behalf of laborers in the train industry. And so from there, then we have others in the Methodist Church. Frank Mason North, who helped to write the social creed that we saw the video on, and Harry Ward, who would later help to found the Methodist Federation of Social Services, which became the Methodist Federation of Social Action, which still stays with us today. But suffice it to say that Methodists have been involved with social issues, just not necessarily as the entire Methodist denomination as being, well, we'll talk about it a little bit more. We have actual agencies and boards that are focused on social issues. Let's see, as I was, and to be a little bit more personal to us, since we're a Chinese church, I was happened to do some searches on the internet. And, you know, a couple of years ago we had a lot of research involved with our own history for our CCUMC, and so I just happened to find a couple extra articles out there on the internet. So this one was from a website. This one was from a website that's part of the Chinese in California series, which is actually a really interesting series on the internet about that tries to document Chinese in America. But this one happened to be that in the 1880s, 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese laborers from coming over. And the theory was that we didn't want immigrants taking jobs from those who needed jobs in America. It's the same story that we heard about from Deborah Lee a couple weeks ago when we talked about immigration. So the same issues just kind of keep cycling over and over. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was intended to keep Chinese out of the U.S. And it was written so that it would exclude laborers. But in this story, talks about a man named Hua Sang, who was admitted to the United States as a student in theology. And he studied here and eventually became a pastor or preacher in Texas, and he was eventually served for the Methodist Church. I thought it was kind of neat that they actually had Chinese Methodists in Texas at that time. But he was actually arrested, and then this became an issue for the courts to decide about the applicability of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this was used to extend the law beyond just laborers, but to professionals and to pastors. And so really it was, the issue wasn't so much the economic arguments, but there was this element of racism trying to push out the Chinese in America. This is another article. This is from, it says this Morning Call. The other name for this newspaper is the San Francisco Call, which was a newspaper kind of like the San Francisco Chronicle, but back in the 1800s. And there's an article here, which I'm sure you can all read. So actually, if you go to the website, you can zoom in on it. But essentially, it was written in 1890. And there's an article about the Methodist Episcopal. Remember, the United Methodist Church began as a Methodist Episcopal Church. But the Eastern Conference back in New York met to protest the one of the bills that came subsequent to the Exclusion Act. So they have an article about the fact that we as United Methodists were protesting the issue of exclusion. So I thought that was kind of some interesting history related to our own culture.
What year was that?
This one is 1890.
Pastor Derek, was the Exclusion Act primarily in California or was it national?
Exclusion Act was national. And there were several federal laws that continue to restrict the immigration of Chinese into America. Now, California itself also had, in fact, several different states had specific laws. So, for example, in the early 1900s, it was illegal for Chinese to own property. So that was particular to the state.
Chinese couldn't own property all the way up to 1949 when it was appealed.
Yeah,
Was that the year?
Yep.
Okay. Yes.
I was just reading an article, and I didn't read it very carefully recently. I think the same thing is happening with excluding laborers in the tech companies now. They're looking for skilled laborers rather than just, laborers. They want skilled workers.
Yeah.
So it hasn't really changed all that much.
So I didn't follow that. I didn't follow that.
Oh.
You think that
this whole
they're...
thing about immigration, about hiring people from, say, India, for instance. They don't want just underskilled laborers. They want people that are skilled working in the tech world.
I'm not sure that's related though, because isn't that a HB1B issue?
Visa.
It's a visa issue.
Well, but it's tied
That
into
may be another
the immigration
issue.
reform that's going through right now. There's a lot of debates between, do you give more visas and entry opportunities to the labor class versus the professional class? Like about 4 years ago, I think, when this immigration reform was on the table, there was actually a big debate between the professionals and the laborers, and that was one of the reasons why the whole issue didn't move forward. And so they're having to address it this time again. And apparently this time around, there's more cooperation in trying to find where how those two different camps can work together to address immigration as a whole. All right. So today's issues, if you were to go to the Methodist website on Church and Society, you'll see that they have a blog and it's like all the different topics that you could talk about for social issues. And so I just threw this up to say that there's a lot of stuff out there because it does touch every part of our life. So I encourage you one of these days to go on to the United Methodist Church's General Board of Church and Society website. We've got a lot of good resources there. All right. So social justice. One last thing. So who does social justice for us as the United Methodist Church? So this is, if you think about us as individuals, we do a lot. But then as part of our connectionalism, we are connected to other churches and through our annual conference and our general conference. And because of our connectionalism, we can act stronger because we are acting together. So who does social justice? Well, we have our conferences. We have general conference and annual conferences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The United Methodist Church has several agencies and boards. So one of them, for example, is the Board of Discipleship, which generates a lot of the material that we use for Sunday schools or for small groups. There's another one that's the General Board of Church and Society, which focuses on issues, social issues that we have to deal with. United Methodist Women is very strong in social issues, and so, for example, when we went to Gummoon, there was actually representation from the United Methodist Women, because they were one of the financial contributors to helping with the renovation project. And I think at our very first meeting when we talked about history, it was the Women's Missionary Society that helped start a lot of these Chinese missions, or helped to support the Chinese missions. I mentioned the Methodist Federation for Social Action is a group of clergy who advocate for social justice. We have conference agencies. So at our annual conference, we have committee or boards that focus on social issues. And then at our local church, we have local churches that are very active with social justice. Okay, so the social principles, I mentioned this at the very beginning. Social principles are a group of principles that we've collected as and agreed upon as United Methodists that basically represent what we believe in. And so if you look on, some of you have on your chairs the Book of Discipline. So if you look at the Book of Discipline, you probably need to go to the, well, you could go to the table of contents, or you could go to, the way you read these is instead of just page numbers, they have paragraph numbers. So if you went to, for example, paragraph 160, I think that might be the beginning of it. So for example, since you all have books of discipline from different years, the actual page number will be different, but the paragraph number will be the same. So paragraph 160.
The paragraph up on the top?
Yes, it'll be in the top left or top right corner.
We don't have it.
Oh, you don't have it? Uh-oh. Oh, you might have such a early, oh yeah, right there. Oh, what year is yours? Oh, that's strange, it should be in there. Did everybody else find? Well, I have the 2012, but it should be in all of them.
It's missing paragraph 110 to 200.
Really? Oh. Okay, because
They had a paragraph.
you have it, right? Paragraph?
Yeah, but then that's on the start.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it'll get you in the general area. So you have what year?
2008.
2008, you have... Okay, so I guess not all of them have it in there. Okay, so basically though, if you, it's part of the Book of Discipline is supposed to include the social principles. Yeah. Oh, okay. That was a surprise. All right. So you'll find the social principles generally, and it'll be interesting. Is it even in the table of contents?
No, it goes from 51 to 100.
Okay. All right. Okay. So currently, it's in the Book of Discipline. Now the social principles, actually, as we saw in the video, the Social Creed came out in 1908, and that was the first time that we solidified or codified some principles that we were going to follow or to stand behind as the United Methodist Church. As part of our history, though, the Methodist Church had several different churches, including the Evangelical Church and the United Brethren Church, and then the Methodist Episcopal Church, and we all came together in 1968. So shortly thereafter, they adopted in 1972 what we now know as the social principles. Yes.
In this BOD, it's the social principles on paragraph 64.
Oh, okay. Maybe they just moved them. Did you guys have it in 64?
Do we have one in
The
64?
paragraph 64.
No, we begin, ours begins on paragraph 70.
Oh, okay, so that actually
We
moved
have
around.
64. 70 to 110 is our social principle.
Okay, so it is in there, it's just at different locations, which kind of defeats the purpose of having paragraph numbers. Okay, well, that's it, we learn something new every time. Okay. Yeah. So in addition to the, so basically the social principles are reviewed every 4 years, and with our general conferences, there's an opportunity to change or add to the social principles. In addition to the social principles is what we call the Book of Resolutions. So if you thought the social, I was going to make copies of the social principles. In fact, I'm going to pass this out. This actually just has the social creed and then a table which describes the social principles. But as you can tell in your books of discipline, it's like 20 pages or so. So sorry I didn't make copies, but I believe you can get on Cokesbury something similar to this. This one's old. This is from.
Laura, you have the original. Laura has the original.
Oh, okay.
The one from that.
Okay. So you might be able to get an abridged form of the social principles. This is kind of neat because it has the text of the social principles, but then it also has some study guides on how you could teach the social principles. So if you were ever interested in teaching a Sunday school class on it, this would be good. But in addition, then we have the Book of Resolutions, and the Book of Resolutions tries to take the social principles, which actually are pretty involved in of themselves, and every 4 years the church has resolutions that are voted upon on different issues, and there could be some very detailed issues. So for example, on let's see. So, for example, this one is okay. I have a misspelling here. so it's on violence. This one is Resolution 182, acts of hate. So it's a statement about hate, and it had to do with hate crimes against, I guess this one would be hate crimes against people of gay or lesbian persuasion. And unfortunately, they have a typo here, so it says acts of hail instead of acts of hate. Okay, or they have a resolution on abuse of older adults. Or they have refugees and immigrants and visitors of the United States. So there's within those the social principles, there's a lot more details. So every year, if there's an issue that'll come up on immigration, on gun control, or whatever, the United Methodist people of the United Methodist Church can vote on these as positions or stands that the church takes. And so this is this one was from 1980, and then this is from 2004. Tell that we've gone through quite a few issues since then. Well, some of them, yeah. So if you get a chance, and I encourage you to kind of browse through here, at the end of each resolution, they'll have a little notation. So this one, for example, on investment ethics, says it was adopted in 1992. And then it was amended and adopted in 2000, and then amended and re-adopted in 2004. And then there are others that will be expired or deleted. So this is kind of the running track record of issues that come and go. Okay. Oh, it might be in there. Okay. So, you know, our understanding of issues changes over time, and that's hopefully that's a sign of progress. And so as we develop new information or new understandings of the Bible or theological insights, those all are reflected in the way we bring issues to the church and try to address those issues. So the social principles, if you look on this sheet are broken up into 6 areas. There's the natural world, the nurturing community, social community, economic community, political community, and world community. And this is just a way to organize all the different issues of life that we try to deal with as a church. And so there's what the role of that category is. There's a faith statement that kind of summarizes our understanding of this issue, our responsibility, and the different issues that may come up for each of these categories. So it's kind of a good way to categorize the different social issues. But again, the social issues are in the Book of Discipline and then the Book of Resolution, so there's quite a bit to digest. But it's there's a little guide here that says how to read this. And it's pretty clear that they don't expect you to go from front cover to back cover. It's basically if you have an issue, you
Look
are
up
like,
something.
well, what does the Methodist Church think about this issue or that issue? Then this is a good way to, you go to the category and you can look up if that particular issue has been addressed. And as you can tell, this addresses quite a bit.
It's a reference book.
And of course,
Yes.
and of course, some evangelicals or fundamentalists would say that we already got a book that to go to.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. There was last week I mentioned there was a website that somebody wrote, "Why Methodists Are Not Christians." And so one of the points was because we go to our Book of Discipline, we don't go to the Bible, which is obviously up for debate. Okay, so the resolutions. Just again, it's social principles are spelled out in the Book of Discipline and the Book of Resolutions. It's not considered church law, but it's a prayerful and thoughtful effort to speak to the issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Okay? And going back to that very beginning, so the social principles call us to be in prayerful, thoughtful, steady dialogue. It's the starting point, as opposed to saying this is what we have to do. I mentioned that they're adopted and revised at General Conference. And so it was interesting, given that this is a neighboring denomination, people have different views from the left to the right, traditional, progressive, contemporary. There's going to be many different views on the world. But this one person I found is questioning how representative are these are the resolutions in the Book of Resolutions, because they are supposed to represent the position of the United Methodist Church. And her point was that it's a very skewed representation of the Methodist Church, because if you looked at the total number of resolutions and where they came from, for example, in 2000, I think this would be 2008. There were 397 issues that came up for vote at General Conference. And out of that, 111 of them, which represents almost 30% of them, came from the General Board of Church and Society. And almost 100 of them came from the General Board of Global Ministries. So that's already almost half of them are from just 2 agencies. Whereas individuals, where did individuals go? I think I even dropped them off there. Individuals, I think there's only like 1 resolution that came from an individual. It represents like 0.25%. So but if you go to annual conference or general conference, there is the legislative session where these issues come up, and basically it's an opportunity for everybody to have a say and a vote. And then they have, actually, to make things a little easier, they break us up into legislative sessions where it's smaller groups that can hash over the issue, and then if it's a unanimous vote or the vote exceeds a certain percentage, then it goes to what we call a consent calendar, which means that the general plenum either votes it up or down. There's not like an individual debate, and that's kind of a process to expedite the voting process. But it's in some ways, it's a very democratic process as far as voting goes. But the question always comes back to as a church, are we voting democratically, or are we trying to discern God's will? And so hopefully, as we go into these legislative sessions, we're all going in there as people of faith. And when we're making our decisions, we're doing that based on how do we, first of all, praying to God, and then trying to discern what is God calling us to. That's kind of like when we go into our SPRB or our vote meetings, that everybody is trying to understand where God is calling us. But it can be a little challenging sometimes when we get into these settings where people are voting, because as part of votes, oftentimes it's the majority wins. Is there a question over here? No? Okay.
Pastor Derek,
Yes.
I'd like to make one comment here in terms of voting as a delegate to annual conference and other meetings like this. We often vote as the individual. Even though I may be a member, I am a member of the CCUMC when I go to conferences, annual conferences and what have you. I don't vote as what I think you might think, or what percentage of my congregation would think this way. I would vote as what I think to be what God wants me to vote. Of course, it comes out in the end as the position of the United Methodist Church, right? But as individuals, we go not because I think this is how Benjamin would vote on this, and so I'm going to vote this way.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact,
All the delegates do that?
Well, we're instructed to, we're asked to observe that. Yeah. Because otherwise it becomes a popularity thing. Yeah. It could.
But wouldn't it
Then
make
you're supposed to
sense?
represent us.
Yeah, wouldn't it make sense that on a topic that's important, that you as a delegate, if we knew what it was, to discuss it amongst our church members and then vote the conscience of the church instead of you individual? Because then that really, since you're representing just your individual, then basically ultimately you have 250, let's say, delegate individual votes versus what the congregation wants. I mean, I would think it would make more sense that they tell you to go back, talk to your congregation about it, and vote that way. I mean, I understand that.
Yeah, and then the other side of that coin might be, as an individual from this church, even though, let's say, it's on the topic of slavery.
Right.
In this particular church today, man, we ought to go 100% slavery. But you elected me as a delegate, and I don't see it as that. Now, you may vote me out in 4 years and say, well, we don't want you to be slavery.
But I guess as a delegate, as an individual, you can choose to go back to your church and talk about it and vote on them, or you can choose to vote your own conscience, I guess. So that's your choice. Okay.
You're right? Is this you right?
That's his position.
So these are good questions. That was one of the first things that when I became a representative to annual conference, I think I even asked Uncle Bert, am I supposed to represent the church, or how am I supposed to vote? And that was the response I got. And indeed, when you go to annual conference at the sessions, they instruct you that you are voting as an individual. But it raises a lot of good questions about how does discernment work? How does faith work in those? And how does this representation versus voting as an individual, how does that reflect faith? And hopefully it's one of those, sometimes it feels like a little obscure question, but it's good for us to think about that. Because there are a lot of issues that we'll deal with that it's really good to go back to what does my faith say. So for example, there's a lot of resolutions or legislation that have to deal with administrative things, aside from like Palestine or immigration or homosexuality. There'll be things like pastor pension benefits or apportionments. And the question we always have to think about is, there's always a business case to be looked at for our finances, but then how does our faith inform us about how we should vote on certain issues? Or what does it mean to say, for example, that we believe that each church should be responsible for paying for its own pastor, as opposed to our monies go into the general United Methodist Fund, and it's as an apportionment, and that's, we rely on, we have a faith in something that says that at the conference level it will be given out in a certain way. So those are, yes.
So what it says to me, having this discussion, is that we as a member of this church, or people who attend this church, we have a responsibility to speak, to connect with our delegate to the annual conference, and just sort of share our viewpoint about things so that the person can discern and can pray about how the vote should go as an individual, having heard one another.
Yeah.
But I don't find that when I was the delegate, I don't find that people come up to talk to me, you know, because they think, well, you know what I'm thinking about. Well, I don't.
Yeah.
It's the first time I heard that, because I don't think as myself that that's how it works, so I had no idea that it's our responsibility to know. And, you know, to
Both
have
ways,
one
right?
person.
It's both ways. It should be both ways, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
delegate
You
should
should
talk
talk with
to
each
his
other.
congregation as well as the congregation.
He's not, he's not obligated. He's not obligated. That's it. But here, Derek, my question is the delegate is obligated to tell us how he voted if we ask him? Or is that open? I mean, because in other words, I agree, he's told to vote his conscience every, which is fine. But then shouldn't he tell us how he voted then?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any legislation that says one way or another, but I think it's kind of implicit that, yeah, if you ask Bert, then
Okay.
he'll share what
Just
his
to give, just for this year, for example, there are plans for the 2 Sundays following annual conference, and those of us who attend will have a chance to report to the congregation. Now, it may not get down to 62 to 32, but it will certainly give us our impressions of these are the issues that were before us during this 3-day conference, and this is how we voted, and it'll carry until the next annual conference.
When I was represented at the annual conference, I tried to write a little excerpt in the messenger about the different issues. Unfortunately, there's usually like 30 different issues every year, and it's a challenge to be able to capture each of them. I think eventually I just got down to just listing them. But yeah, I think there is opportunity for us to spend more time focused on the issues and providing that feedback or thoughts to our representatives as they go to annual conference. One of the things that our district does a really good job at is just prior to annual conference, they have a session. They've had it at El Sobrante like three weeks before, where they'll actually have the lay representatives come and they'll explain each of the issues. So yeah, I think there is opportunity for us to take that information and bring it back to the local churches and have some good discernment time talking about what does this mean.
To follow what Bert said, we are scheduling this time on June 30th, I believe, to have that feedback session. And I think you might also do part of that in the worship as well. Is that what's?
So I heard that 2 Sundays after, the 23rd and 30th.
Well, 23rd we can't because I think there's some other plans in.
Just planning, I think at the time.
Definitely the 30th is on the schedule for this gathering.
So yeah, I was trying to get a list of the resolutions for our annual conference for this year to distribute them, but unfortunately they haven't come out yet. So probably in the next week or two we'll see those. So great. So speaking of issues, yes.
Is there the same number of delegates in the conference?
No, the way that it works at the annual conference level is the number of pastors, I guess it's pastors in full connection, what you have, you get an equivalent number of lay representatives. So if we have 2 full-time pastors, for example, or actually they don't have to be full-time, but they have to be elders, then we would get 2 lay people. Okay. In our case, we just have the 1 elder, and so we'll get 1 representative. And then
2 votes.
Yeah, 2 votes, basically. We also get a alternate who we elect at our charge conferences. So if our lay representative gets sick, then we have somebody else who can step in. But actually, anybody can attend annual conference. Actually, probably even annual general conference. Right?
All
Yeah.
open.
It's just a matter, and you actually have a voice, but you just may not be able to vote unless you're an official delegate. So, and it's a good opportunity if you get a chance to go up. This year it'll be the week of the, what is it, 18th or so?
Right.
Up in Wednesday in Sacramento, and get a chance to just see how the Methodist Church works.
Definitely we'll go on Saturday, Pastor Emily's being ordained.
Yes. So
22nd.
on the Saturday, the very last thing that they do at annual conferences, they'll have a ordination ceremony. And so this year, if you haven't heard already, Pastor Emily will be ordained. So everybody's
Full elder.
Are they lobbyists? For
Or, you know, you have to do a vote, how do you get all information?
So, yeah, so they're, along with the registration materials that you get for an annual conference, and actually you can go onto the Cal Nevada United Methodist Church website, and they'll have the list of the resolutions, and when anybody can submit a resolution to be voted on, and basically when you submit the resolution, you're supposed to provide some background information, some impacts to the conference and financial impacts, and then it's usually a lot of whereases, and then therefore this is what we want approved. So that's the beginning point. Then there's the session like we had at El Sobrante where people can come to find out more information. But beyond that, it's up to the individual and to the local churches or the different groups to try to find more information. I don't recall of a specific lobby, like an external lobby. But there are, I get the impression at General Conference, there are like clusters of people with a certain agenda that will get together. And, yeah. Okay, so we're actually running short on time because I was going to have us spend actually half the time just talking about issues. So what I'll just say then before we get into that is that we're called again to prayerful and steady dialogue of issues. The social principles are the starting point. And oftentimes when we're hit with an issue like on immigration reform or gun control, our first instinct is to have a reaction. Do I agree or disagree? And that's just human nature. But we as Christians are also called to take that next step for this prayerful and steady dialogue so that we can have a faithful witness. So when we do that, it's, here are some of the things that we may, how we may approach looking at the issues. What does it say in our book of resolutions or our social principles? What does my personal faith say? And then John Wesley gave us the 3 simple rules that we can use. Yes.
Do all the good in all the ways, in all the ways, or something like that.
Okay, so 3 simple rules: do no harm, do good, and
stay in love with God.
actually the formal one is follow the ordinances of God.
Just Jesus.
That's right.
That's Jesus, that's right.
So what I'd like to do is give us a couple topics for us to deal with. So we'll break into, why don't we do groups of 4. So count 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Okay. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is just talk about this is the issue, and then think about what is the main issue being addressed here. How does the quadrilateral? What insights does the scripture, tradition, experience, or reason provide? And then the 3 simple rules. Is there harm? Is there good? Does it follow the ordinances of God? Okay? So I'd like you to maybe take, I think we can do maybe at least 2 rounds, maybe 3. So get in your groups, talk about this issue. Yes?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. Group 2 over there? Group 1 over here?
It was on
Group 3, 4?
How about group 2 over here, back here?
Stay here.
Group 1's right here.
We're going, Davey.
Give me.
Yeah, we'll see you before.
We're gonna move crisply, so spend a little time to get to it, and then we're gonna go to the next topic.
Okay.
Gambling.
Gambling.
That's why I didn't really
Okay. Well, it's supposed to be
Are you free anytime?
we're full.
So you can join us.
Somebody over there?
Are we too?
Yeah, we are too.
We're full.
Okay, I think the main issue is gambling, because I'm basically, as a church, even though we want to raise funds for something good, is gambling okay? I think that's what it's saying. What the main issue, I think, what insight, what the Bible says. I think the Bible says about gambling, I mean, it's for a good thing. And people, people the life from gambling, but it's still gambling.
I guess it has something.
Yeah.
I don't think
Can go to form again. I guess.
I mean, some people get hooked on it. I mean, they go, once a week and they
So I was really to me, I look at it, you say it's of course for the mission program in Guatemala.
Is it bad? You think it's bad? Yeah, see, he thinks, I think it's gambling too, but I think it's real, not real. You think single gambling? Simple form, you think it's simple, okay. I like the way simple form, so it's not like playing cards or what you call it, but it's still gambling, right?
Yes.
Okay. You think that's wrong? You think that the Bible says it's wrong to gamble?
It's wrong. It's wrong.
But for good reasons. So, okay, so you say, you think, at all, you think because you said we shouldn't do that? The more I think about it, I agree with you, I think it's probably wrong. Maybe they should find a better way to raise funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be a better way.
Yeah, I mean, instead, if someone may get offended and say, basically, that church is gambling, maybe, but I bet you there are a lot of churches that have been,
That's what I thought.
lots of churches. But if it turns people off, it turns some people off.
Yeah, because actually, the way
Well, I guess they could change it. I mean, if there's a bingo winner, I mean, the winner's not gonna get all the money.
Well, I imagine part of it goes to the, I imagine the big winner, let's say wins like $100, maybe $25, and goes to the project, he wins $75, you know what I'm saying? But either way, it's still gambling, but that's the issue, is it, I don't know. What do you think? You think that the church should do it?
It's for a good cause, that's the only way to do it.
So you think because it's for a good cause?
That's why I said, because, back in the 1805, when they have all these things, all these things happening, business was, slavery, all this, selling, they have all this whole robbery go again, all this, started, been a long time, just it's a part of the
We all think it's gambling, and we think that before we move on, gambling and it's for good cause, maybe it's okay to.
Okay, so.
Could be okay. Other churches are
Spend another half an hour on it, please. But that was kind of an interesting one because it kind of pits an issue of gambling versus something that might be a really good cause. And that's true of a lot of issues that we deal with, where there's a lot of conflicting motivations or issues that we need to deal with. So in this case here, I just threw up one of the social principles is Gambling is a menace to society. It is a best interest of moral, social, economic, and spiritual life and destructive of good government. So again, this is a starting place to think about what was the focus when other people looked at this particular issue, and then use that as a starting place for again looking at what does the quadrilateral say, or how does it inform us? What do the simple rules tell us? Okay. All right, moving on to the next one. This is a relatively recent issue. Actually, well, this might be last year. The Supreme Court on Monday, could be Monday a year ago, dismissed a long-standing appeal from scientists who tried to block funding of stem cell research on human embryos. And one of the issues is that the field of embryonic stem cell research has been highly controversial because in most cases the research process involves destroying the embryo, typically 4 or 5 days old, after removing the stem cells. Okay, so the question is, if this issue came up to you, if you happen to be a judge on the Supreme Court, or voting on issues of stem cell research, how does your faith inform you? Okay, so go ahead, talk about it.
Question. How are the human embryos even available?
It's regulated genetically.
Yeah. Well, what do you think the main issue?
I think they
Yeah, the choice of life, right?
Yeah.
Okay, abortion.
Life, just life, killing a life, right? But then they said, try to create funding so that basically the people decide wanted them not to do it, right? So they block funding, so basically, of course, it's okay to do it, right? Is that what you're saying?
The scientists were asking for funding to research. No, the scientists were asking for research funding so that they could use embryos.
Okay, so basically, the Supreme Court said they can't do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're basically saying.
It's like a baby.
The researchers but the thing is that but are the embryos basically babies that have been aborted? Is that what they must be, right? Because otherwise you just don't take it from a live baby that's right. So basically if they're aborted, then I mean they're gonna die anyway, right? So what do you think? I don't believe abortion.
Oh, right here it says it says they shall not include experiments where
but it's not producing with embryo. An embryo, I mean, in other words, you're taking what's coming. Yeah, but yeah, you're right. But what I'm saying is that the embryo has been taken out of it. In other words, there's an abortion. And so what do you do then? I mean, you just it's gonna be waste anyway, right? So I mean, why waste the stem cell when you get research? You know. I mean, obviously, you don't do the abortion period, right? That's the first thing, right? I don't know if that is that.
the human embryo is not even fertile. I guess there's people embryos before fertilization.
The embryo has to be fertilized.
Oh, it has to be fertilized immediately.
Yeah. And it's being aborted.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is being aborted.
What do you guys think?
What do you think? I think
Catholics are definitely against it.
yeah.
But okay, but let's say you decided you don't want the baby, you're going to force the baby period, you can abort it. So basically what you're saying is that you can't do it, you can't waste too much waste already because you made your decision. Why waste the stem cells? My point.
Take 1 more minute.
The double, you know.
Take 1 more minute.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
What would you do?
Shouldn't be done the first time.
Right, we agree.
Yeah, if it does happen, then obviously the scientists think that's a waste.
Yeah, because the purpose is to save more lives, right? Because the stem cells supposed to have really rich. See, that's like, go back to the gambling again. Basically, gambling's not good, but for a good cause, then maybe it's okay, right?
Yeah, they're gambling embryo lives in order to save other other lines.
No, but the embryos are border, so it's in a border. So in other words, okay, if
30 seconds.
my wife is pregnant, we're not gonna just take the embryo just to get the stem cells. We want to hold the baby, okay? It's the people that don't want the baby, avoiding it. That's where this comes up.
I wonder if they create the embryo artificially outside. Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up. Okay, some good discussions, right? So again, you could probably spend half an hour or days talking about this. A lot of conflicting agendas and motivations, and oftentimes it's we kind of get into the track of trying to define terms or try to figure out what is that fine line here or there, and it's always good for us to keep coming back to the question of, because we all have our different opinions or reactions, but what does Scripture say, or does Scripture even have anything to say about it, or what does tradition say, or experience, or reason, and then the three simple rules. Was there harm involved with this, or is there a good that can come out of it, and what does God have to say? Okay, so there are many different ways to look at this issue. This is one that came up in a recent Book of Resolution. We had urged adequate public funding of genetic research so that projects not likely to be funded by private grants will receive adequate support, and so that there will be greater accountability to the public by those involved in setting the direction of genetic research. So there are at least 5 to 6 different issues, resolutions on genetic research, including stem cell research. But it's if you go through the social principles, it actually represents a very balanced. It's not like this is what we believe. It's here are the positive things about this subject. Here are some of the negative things that we need to be cautious of. So in this case, one of the resolutions was that there was a general feel that genetic research is positive, but there does need to be review and understanding of those impacts. Okay, next one. I'm giving an easier one.
Here's an even easier one. I want to let everybody know that on Tuesday night, Michelle and Jonathan and Pastor and Jane and I went to the Oakland City Frank Lagawa Plaza, and we participated in the prayer vigil that night that was being sponsored for immigration reform. And I think we announced it last week, and we went to that, and I think we're going to have a chance to share, perhaps not this week, but again, social principles and how do we work together as a community for just wages and helping people have a decent living, in our Bay Area. So Pastor Debbie was there, and about maybe 200 people. And then Jonathan went on Wednesday, May Day. Yeah. And then also Saturday, yesterday.
No, Wednesday, today.
Today, okay. So anyway, the point is we take part in our community activities and live our life beyond the walls of this wonderful church that we call Jesus.
I have a sign to carry, but so
good, and you can show that at fellowship time. But
okay, so this will be the last one. Yeah, for now. The last one. So this one is the International Court of Justice, which is part of the United Nations, should indict members of the Bush and Obama administration for crimes against humanity, specifically for the torture of prisoners in Guantanamo. Yeah, this is prisoners. So these are the ones who've been accused of terrorism. And it was kind of interesting. This week there was an issue where there's a hunger strike going on down there. The authorities down there are accused of force feeding the prisoners by putting IV through their nose and the justification that Obama had was we don't want anyone to die down there.
So let's just increase the life.
So you'll have an immediate reaction, but again, let's think about what this.
Yeah, when we were at war, they put all the prisoners there.
Yeah, they put.
They have no right to trial. They're not even.
Okay, wait, what's the issue first of all? Okay.
It was probably the issue.
I don't really get the
Because they're not treated the Americans.
Okay, wait, but first of all, can we assume that considered Guantanamo, are they war criminals? Is there a reason why they're there?
I believe a lot.
You didn't really wouldn't be there, right?
I believe a lot of them are not guilty.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that they're unjustly. Okay, so let's assume that the one person that's in there, the one the mastermind of 9/11, they know that he was the mastermind 9/11. Okay.
They're not given the right to trial like American citizens.
Well, but they said they're quiet back there under war criminal. There's certain things they can take the right to wait if they're convicted as a war criminal. So it's another because first they're not U.S. citizens. That's one distinction. The distinction is that they're treated as war criminals. But I agree with you. If you're saying that they're unjustly treated because we don't know if he's guilty, okay, then that's a different issue. But I guess we assume that they're there that they are guilty of a war, being a war terrorist.
Yes, I think it's like a torture, when they, not like you said, they're not treated like prisoners, like other prisoners over there, to get treated. They don't give them a chance. They're there, they treat them so bad, they don't even have time to go. To go over there and, go to the court or chief judge or anything over there, treated so badly,
but should they have the same rights as U.S. citizens?
I mean, there's no public accountability. They're not telling the truth to the Americans about what's going on. Or the truth.
They're telling the truth. It's like that.
I can't answer that. I don't know.
Let's take 1 more minute.
I mean, it's just as bad as any dictator torturing.
They're
their work.
Yeah, that's why Obama. He was torturing people. So
I'm very liberal. So.
Okay, but let's just say that the guy was convicted. He was deported and everything else. He was convicted of war criminal. Let's say convicted of 9/11 bombing, he was working bomb. Okay, then he didn't have bombs. Then would you
start to wrap up.
change your position? Then the guy was convicted with the proven guilty of war crime. Should he have the same right to treat the same way as someone else that's
I believe a lot of those people were accidentally placed in.
Okay, let's wrap up.
And they had to wait their years.
Let's gather back to conclusion.
Literally, basically, this is involved with war crime.
Okay, so just really quickly, a lot of issues. I mean, one of the more obvious ones is the issue of torture prisoners. And so that's one issue. The other is the fact that we have this international court, and here's a resolution in our part of our social principles that we believe in the international justice system, and we endorse the United Nations and its related bodies as the best instruments in existence to achieve a world of justice and law. So just to throw another slant on that whole issue. So let me, as we wrap up, let me just say a couple things. One is that as you notice that there's a lot of competing issues, either two positives that are counterposed, or there's a negative that could possibly do good, or a positive that could do bad. And unfortunately, that's just part of life, that we're struggling with these very conflicting situations all the time. Just a couple from my own experience. Let me point out two last things. One is, and I'm just trying to struggle with this, and maybe you all have your own viewpoint, but sometimes for me, I felt that there's a position I might take outside of the church because of my understanding of economics and politics and what have you. And then there's my position as a person of faith. And I haven't figured out yet whether those should always be the same, or whether I can act at certain times as one versus the other. That's one thing to think about. The other was something that really struck me in our immigration session, and I kind of spoke to this at the very end, that oftentimes we like to have just this big moral right that we can say, yes, immigration is good, and excluding people is bad. But oftentimes we find that just the systems that are in place make it very difficult. It's just a very complicated system, and there's things to be said on many different sides. And it can be almost paralyzing to try to figure out what is that big principle that we should all follow. And so I thought it was very helpful for when Debbie put up that list of some very specific values that we have. And so it was easier for me to take action or think about taking action for specific values as opposed to finding what's that one thing that will address the whole immigration issue, because oftentimes there's not that one big thing that we can do. So again, something for you to think about. How do you work in this context of very conflicting situations? But bottom line is, as United Methodists, we have an obligation to bear fruitful witness, Christian witness to Jesus Christ, the living reality at the center of the church's life and witness. And to fulfill this obligation, we reflect critically on our biblical and theological inheritance, striving to express faithfully the witness we make in our own time. In other words, we have a responsibility as people of faith to act upon our faith, to represent Christ out there, whatever the position may be. But we have that responsibility to tie our faith and action together. So the question always comes back, what do I believe? And once I know what I believe, what am I going to do about it? All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,